In fact, in my very brief presentation, I would like to further develop on a couple of issues which were hinted by both Ben and Veena. In fact, I want to talk a little more about the whole question of re-allocations, and I'm going to speak more from an Indian perspective, the way it is happening and how it is leading to more inequities in the water sector. And second issue I'd like to pick on is this whole question of institutional reforms which is taking place in the country in the water sector, which is primarily depoliticizing the entire discourse around water. So these are the 2-3 issues which I like to focus for this brief presentation. Now let me start with the 2 introductory comments about the type of inequities and the basis for such inequities which is taking place. One is what I call broadly the spatial or locational disadvantage or emanating from the biophysical characters of water, which to some extent Veena hinted. I mean, one classic example of this type of inequities, which is coming from the spatial, or the location in which your land or where you are located in a watershed, is the whole case of micro watershed development program in India. Basically, what happens is that all the conservation and recharging and all the type of things like grazing or taking certain type of crops or other type of things are enforced on the people who have land in the upper reaches of the watersheds, which is very often occupied by the resource poor sections in a village or in a watershed context. However, the whole the way the water gets recharged and the way the water gets accumulated and the people who use this type of water are located in the valley portion and things. So we did some type of cross-section of analysis or times to look at the type of impact watershed development programs have given rise to in the country. We find that not even 1% of such programs have crafted institutional norms in terms of equitable distribution or access, so that some type of some way the spatial inequities can be taken care of. Second point which I would like to say here is that, again emanating from the biophysical character of water, is that water is both a local and a non-local resource. In fact, the type of water which we see at a very micro scale, like a micro watershed or a village scale, is one thing, but water is also much more than that. When you talk about sub-basins and basins which are hundreds of thousands of kilometers as a catchment, and the type of water they bring in is very different order of magnitude. So unless we understand water is both a local and a non-local resource, and it has got scale, because I'm bringing this issue because it has a relationship with our understanding on equity, rights, and entitlements. Now, one of the issues which we find in the water discourse in the country is that, I mean, very often we also take very localist viewpoint about entitlements, equity, and rights. Now, can a local community say that all the water which flows through its doorstep is rights, or rights need to be redefined in terms of a proportionate share, basically to meet one's basic needs, like whether it is drinking water or dilutes and things. So I think we need to problematize this whole issue about what we mean by rights and equity and entitlements, and this is being played out in a big manner, the way the watershed development programs are being taken up in this country, and where we have found that this type of development programs is actually creating more and more inequities because of inequitable access to water. And only very few projects we can find people have really crafted institutional norms of access and other things where this type of inequity has been taken into account. Secondly, we also find that there are, especially in a country like or many developing societies, we have different bases of inequities. I mean, Ben mentioned about capitalism, for example, class or economic basis. But we also find in South Asian societies like India, caste, patriarchy, ethnicity, etc., also play out, and they map onto each other. I mean, water inequities and this type of social inequities, which are historically given to some extent, are also play out together. In fact, caste is an important dimension. I would also say patriarchy or women's position in the country, also main thing, where the erstwhile untouchables, or whom we call the Dalits today, are even excluded from touching water. And in fact, in many villages even today you have different type of water sources, or two water sources, one for the upper caste and one for the Dalits and things. So you find crass forms of inequities still existing in the Indian societies. In fact, the second point I want to say, which is also a very important dimension or linkage with equity, is that water access and entitlements are often mediated or determined by property or property relations. In fact, in the domestic water sphere, we find that there's a clear divide between the urban and the rural in terms of access, in terms of both quantity and quality and things. There is also studies which talk about the spatial inequities within cities. For example, cities which get water from the organized sector, that is from the governmental agencies which supply water, and areas which are dependent, especially slums or other type of squatters, or which is often termed as illegal spaces and occupants. They have to depend on the informal market like water tankers and that type of things. And there are studies to show that the type of water they use in terms of quantity and quality, they pay much higher price than the rest of the city and things. In fact, legality of domicile is being also brought into the question. For example, the recent judgment by the Mumbai High Court has clearly said that whether one can prove one's legally one's domicile or a citizenship in a city, but no government should be, or the urban governance structure should exclude people from the basic access to water. This was a recent judgment by the Mumbai High Court in the state of Maharashtra. Similarly, for water for agriculture or for productive purposes, we find that it's also again much more clearly mediated by land. Water rights go with land rights, in the sense that if I own land, then I get access to water. If I own more land, then I get access to more water. In fact, this is also something which I think Ben mentioned in his presentation. So the whole question is also how do you de-link to a great extent water rights from land rights, and there have been interesting examples in the country where people have tried to do this type of de-linking of water rights and land rights and make water much more accessible to even the landless or other type of persons without property. In fact, the third issue which I would like to bring up, this whole question of the large-scale reallocations of water which is taking place from agriculture to urban and industrial uses. In fact, in this picture, what you see is one of the important large dams in the country called the Hirakud Dam, which is built or commissioned around 1950s, none other than by the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, who said, dams are like temples. He had compared that a famous imagination he had where calling dams and temples in the same language. But Hirakud is a dam which was primarily constructed as a flood cushioning system, especially Mahanadi River, on which this dam is based, is known for its floods. And second, it was also designed or mainly constructed for meeting agriculture needs and things. But over the last 20 years, we find that more and more water, either legally or illegally, getting diverted or reallocated to industries and the growing urban uses. There's a massive farmers movement who is resisting such type of diversions, and partly have been successful in at least stopping the further reallocation which is taking place. In fact, the Hirakud case is not alone. This is happening all across the country. The state I come from, that is Maharashtra, in fact, in the last 10 years or something, we find that more than 2,000 million cubic meter of water has gone out of agriculture to urban and industrial uses. Now, when I say 2,000 million cubic meters, it means the livelihoods of people to the extent of roughly about 2 million people who are dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods. Now, one is not arguing that no water should get reallocated from a particular use to another use. In fact, this type of reallocations would take place because as the society is moving forward, the production bases change, people's livelihoods options change and things. But the issue is that how do we bring in systems, how do we bring in processes which is much more transparent, and also say putting in things in place that by reallocating water or taking certain amount of water from particular use to another, how do you put in measures so that the negative impacts of such reallocations can be engaged with. So in India, I think, for example, because of the increasing urbanization and industrialization, and in fact, this whole question of fairness in terms of intersectoral water allocations and the conflicts around that is also embedded. The type of developmental paradigm the nation is going or encouraging, because we are now again back into 8 to 10% of growth rate and things, and through the industrial route. So it is but natural that this type of reallocations are taking place, and there are also resistance movements around it. So we need to reallocate. Look how these reallocations are taking place, how just they are, and how are they also creating inequities in the process. The last point which I'd like to make is the whole type of institutional reforms which are taking place. As I said earlier, these are basically efforts at depoliticizing the whole water discourse. Now, one of the innovations which are coming up state after state in the country is this whole question of institution called independent water regulatory authorities. Independent regulators are coming in the water sector. I mean, Maharashtra was the first state which was brought in about maybe 7-8 years back in 2005 through a legal instrument. Now, whole lot of critical water sector issues, which I call basically political issues, in terms of how do you decide entitlements, on what basis entitlements are given to people, who gets access, how pricing or water tariff policies are decided. These are basically issues of fall in the political realm. Now, all these issues are being given to the independent regulators, saying that a professional agency will be able to deal with this. It is creating its own problems. People are resisting such type of, taking these issues out of the political arena and giving to a few, the so-called independent regulators and things. On the other hand, at a very micro local levels, the institutions which are crafted, for example, this whole talk about participatory irrigation management through water use associations. There is also deliberate effort to de-link from the elected, which is the legitimate governance institutions at the local level, like a Gram Panchayat and things, and they move pretty parallelly, and they are not even accountable. Such broadly what you call the community-based organizations or water associations and other type of institutions are being crafted, or even watershed associations or watershed committees are completely dealing from the elected bodies, which are the legitimate institutions for governance. In fact, a couple of studies we did at a river basin scale earlier, we also find that there's a complete absence of what I call a meso scale, whether it's a sub-basin or a basin scale institutions. We find vibrant institutions at the grassroots or at a micro watershed or a village scale in terms of water use associations, watershed committees, pani sumitis, and various other type of things. And at the national or at the sub-national levels, like a state level, we find water resource departments and various other type of agencies. But at the sub-basin basin level, we find hardly any institutions. And even if there are efforts to craft certain river basin organizations, they are basically bureaucratic efforts where the department heads come together to create such bodies. They are not democratic institutions built from below. So there's also need to engage with this type of process which is taking place, and how do you bring in institutions for governance which are much more politically embedded in our system. There are two experiences which I like to, things are not lost, because there are also very interesting experiences of resistance and also positively trying to engage with some of these issues. In fact, Ben also hinted a couple of them. Now, on this screen, you find the pictures of a village called Hivre Bazaar, very close to Pune, where I live. It's a micro watershed context where the people together under the leadership of a person called Popatra Pawar, whose picture you can see towards the bottom of the screen with the lush green fields and the well, is that through harvesting water locally, they have been able to actually change the face of this village. In fact, what did they do? They crafted institutions for water sharing. In fact, they brought in two norms. One, saying that no deep borewells will be dug by anybody for agriculture purposes, and borewells would be only for drinking water or basic water needs and things. Second, no farmers will go for water intensive crops like sugarcane or other type of things. In fact, there's a very interesting thing how these norms have been adopted by the whole village and how they have been doing it and things. But it also brings in certain issues. Now, for example, can such institutional norms be developed, applied at a very micro scale? Because what I said, water is both a local and a non-local resource. Now, what we find today is that just on the boundary of this village, the downstream villages are going for a pumping race, right? This one by taking more and more increasing number of borewells and things. So some of these considerations about equity, and the type of institutional norms which craft either for equity or sustainable use of water need to be also embedded in a much larger context, which I think is the point which we are also trying to make. I mean, at least we try to see that. So very often localist solutions might offer certain pathways, but then it also has its own problems. So we need to put it in a much larger context. So here scale becomes a important issue. The second experience, I think, again, Ben mentioned about this whole movement in Maharashtra, is in South Maharashtra, where partly I have been also part of this movement. There is a movement to restructure some of the public irrigation systems on more equitable lines. In fact, this is one of the larger gatherings of this movement where people have been discussing the strategies in organizing agitations and movements. And as a result of this movement, they have been able to bring the government of Maharashtra for negotiations, and at least on paper, the government has agreed on a pilot basis to restructure some of the government or the public irrigation systems on more equitable lines, where per capita water allocation would be the norm. So there are some interesting positive experience from which I think we can learn and draw lessons in case we want to bring in the whole water governance and reorient it more equitable lines. So in conclusion, I mean, there could be many more things to be said. I just want to say 4 things. One, both the spatial disadvantage and the historically embedded social inequities to be taken into account when we talk about equity in water governance and things. Both these things are very important but neglected today. Second, water entitlements are used norms to be determined, evolved, or operationalized, taking into account the whole scale in a nested manner. Otherwise, we find very often unsustainable water uses generated at a very local level, and the micro and the macro never meet to some extent. And if you have a sub-basin or basin level impacts and such things, then probably the scale needs to be worked out. We also need to talk about equity not only within the village or the micro watershed, maybe equity within sub-basins and basins is an important issue. Water reallocations, if needed, it has to be done in a transparent and democratic manner and causing minimum negative impacts on the existing users or users. I think this is a very important issue which is coming up in India, and this is going to, this whole conflicts around water reallocations are going to increase in the country. And also, finally, setting up mesoscale, whether sub-basin, basin scale, democratic institutions for governance is also another precondition if you have to nearly push the agenda for equity in water governance. So I stop here and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was a really great presentation. I think a lot of us learned a lot from that presentation, and I think that it's going to give us a lot to talk about here going forward. I was particularly interested in kind of this discussion of the mesoscale, and maybe kind of see more people want to respond to that. In your observation, there was very, very few. I'm curious if maybe some of our attendees have some observations or thoughts that their experiences of also not finding many mesoscale institutions, or perhaps they have some experience with some that they'd like to kind of reflect upon.